Okay, so waiting for this to connect, trying to go live. Gotta love technology, right? Especially when you turn it on.
There you go.
Oh, come on now. There we go. Helps when you hit the right button, right? That's the... That should be it. All right, so we're going to take a break from Isaiah. Truth be told, I was looking, I like to just teach straight through. I don't like breaks and that sort of thing. But I got to looking at the next portion of Isaiah chapter 1, and at the first verse we would have addressed, I was like, yeah, that's not a good one to use for Mother's Day. So we're going to put Isaiah on hold for just a moment. We're going to stay in that realm. We're going to stay back in that era to a degree. Because something that caught my eye in thinking about Mother's Day, when you look at talking about King Uzziah, right? So that's the first year of Isaiah as prophet, is during the reign. It's the last year of the reign of King Uzziah. And we see that over in 2 Kings chapter 15. We talked about this the other day. But in verse 2, so chapter 15 of 2 Kings, verse 2, he was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 52 years. His mother was Jecoliah from Jerusalem. Now, of course, the kingship, the throne is passed through the father. Most of what you see in Jewish history is passed through the father. But it's not to say that mothers don't have an important role in an important place. Now, obviously, biologically speaking, if we don't have mothers, we don't exist. Men cannot have babies. Just want to make sure that's clear for everybody, in case we're confused by all the gobbledygook that's coming out of the media and society right now. And we know for sure that mothers are extremely important, because obviously number one mother out there is Mary, being the mother of Jesus. Now, I'm not going to go down the road of worshiping her. We're not going to pray to her. But we are going to acknowledge the fact that she was a woman that God looked down and said, you're righteous enough to carry the Christ child. And we know for a fact, Jesus being a good Jew, being a good son, not just being a good Jew. We know there's the commandment that we're to honor our mothers and fathers. Honors our fathers and mothers, that our time on earth will be long. It's the only commandment that comes along with a threat, so to speak. So if you don't honor your mother and father, then you're going to be dealt with, right? And thank God that our God is merciful, because there's a whole lot of folks disrespecting their parents out there. But we know that Jesus loved his mother, his earthly mother. And we know that when you look at the crucifixion at John 19. So John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27. So this is either as he's being nailed to the cross, or as they stand him up. And he looks down. And let's see here, verse 26. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, which is John, standing nearby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. So we're going to kind of look at that in relationship of how we are to treat and respect mothers, and what a good mother can and can't do, as we pay homage to our mothers, and we thank God for creating our mothers. and given us life that way. So, dear Lord, Heavenly Father, we just thank you again, dear Lord, for our mothers. We thank you for life that you give us as a whole and the way that you designed it, dear Lord, through a father and a mother, dear Lord, a husband and a wife. And we just ask that you would be with us today as we dig into your word, that our hearts and our minds are open to you, that we may give all due respect, dear Lord, to your creation and to your plan. We just ask that you would be with those folks, dear Lord, in Tennessee dealing with the earthquake, the folks down here with the rain and the weather we've had, with the trees falling down, dear Lord. Just provide the care and the needs for those that are dealing with any sort of damage, dear Lord. And we just, again, ask you to be with this church as we go forth in your name and seek to spread your kingdom in this community. And we just ask for all this in Jesus' precious name. So it's really should be apparent as you read through the Bible. There's this, especially within the pagan and the false religions, that there's an effort to actually take away from fatherhood and to overemphasize women and mothers. And I'm saying that to say this, that we should keep things in the proper context and that we should be able to properly look at God's design. He created Adam first, then he created Eve, and she's the mother of all the living. And it's from Adam and Eve that all of the human race came from. And she made her mistakes, but I believe that she corrected herself, and she and Adam both correct themselves once outside the garden, and they both played a part in teaching the next generation about God and who he is, and what was going on, and especially by relaying the lessons from the garden. And we know that when we look at the characters like Timothy, who was half Jew and half Gentile, his mother was a Jew, so his mother and his grandmother, and Paul points this out specifically in his epistles and his writings to Timothy, that Timothy was a good Jew because his mother had taught him. And so we should always be thankful for the mothers that would stand in. Now, he wasn't going to be a good Jew because of his father, although his father had something to do with raising him, because he was a man who was well respected in the community. Even when he got into ministry and Paul took him under his wing to mentor him, he was well respected. But it was his mother who taught him about God and about the Messiah. And so mothers play extremely important roles. And again, we're not going to overemphasize Mary's role, but she is someone to be respected for sure, because she absolutely said yes to God when he came along and said, okay, you're going to carry the Christ child. And for her to be a willing and proper servant of God is a tremendous thing that should be honored and respected and appreciated. But as we look at what society's trying to do, you got society out there right now saying men can have babies. They're trying to say men are not important. Again, you got to have both. You got to have a male and a female. You can't, we're not into asexual reproduction. And no matter how far you go down through society, you still have to have a man's sperm in order to make a baby. That's just a fact. That's the way God designed it and God set it up. But keeping that in mind, there's roles for mothers and fathers. And God designed mothers to be nurturing and to be caring. It's dad comes along, kid scrapes a knee, dust it off, shake it off, and get back on the bicycle, or get back out there and keep working. Mom's going to come along and, let's clean it up. Let's make sure it's not bad. It's not infected, and, rest. Mom's going to be a little more I'm not going to say considerate, but mom's a little more concerned. Dad's trying to teach the kids to be tough. Mom wants to be nurturing and caring, and that's fine, and that's great. And it's good to have a nurturing and caring mother. And Jesus himself had his mother that he loved so much that he was going to make sure that she was provided for after his death. He was the firstborn. It was the responsibility was on him to provide for his mother, provide for all the women. Jewish society was set up so that the women didn't have a whole lot of property rights. Doesn't mean they couldn't go out and do business, doesn't mean they couldn't go out and do things, but they still had to have a husband or at least a son. And we kind of get the idea when you read that in John chapter 19 that Joseph probably has passed away before Jesus was crucified. Otherwise, why would he have to tell his beloved disciple John to take care of his mother? And the other side of this is, I think part of the reason he did this wasn't to exclude his own brother, Jesus' own brothers and sisters, but his own brothers specifically. We know that James wrote some epistles, and that was his half-brother. But they weren't full believers in him as the Messiah. So when I read through John chapter 19, I get the impression that Jesus wanted somebody who was a follower of his specifically to look after his mother. Now we know that his brothers and everybody came along after the fact when they realized he really was the Messiah. But either way, Jesus was providing for Mary that she would always have someone there to care for her and support her so that she could do whatever she was going to do. We know from other scripture and other places with in regards to, especially in the book of Ruth, a kinsman redeemer. So somebody in the family would come along, if the husband died, somebody in the family would come along and take responsibility for the mother so that she would then be able to have a son and keep the land and keep all the possessions within the family, within Israel. And so we see that God set up a plan. And we see that God's intention is for everyone to take care of each other. And certainly he allowed for that in Jewish law, but we see that in the book of Acts when they called the first deacons because the widows and the orphans were being neglected. And widows and orphans were allowed to go live in the temple if they had no other means of support, provided they were actually Jews and they were at a certain age. If they were still young enough to work and still young enough to go find another husband, they had to go do that. But God has set up a system that provides for women, for mothers. And we can also see where finding a good wife, right? We're told in Proverbs 31, verses 10 and 28, an excellent wife who can find, she is far more precious than jewels. That's verse 10. Verse 28, her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. So a good mother is a good wife to begin with and will raise her children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So it's so important as followers of Christ, as followers of Yahweh, of God, with Jew or Gentile, but as followers of God, it is so important for us to teach and train the next generation. It is, and like I said, we saw that with Timothy. His mother and grandmother were faithful to teach him about the law and about the Messiah and who Jesus was. We see that throughout. You see Hannah, Sarah. Of course, Sarah wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but ultimately she corrects herself and she is a good mother to the sons of Abraham, and that allows for us to get into the line of Jesus. But without going all the way down through the whole of that portion of Proverbs 31, all the same, a good wife is a good mother, and hopefully as a good follower of God, then they're going to be an even better mother. But what's interesting is, and again, this is going back to what I was saying about 2 Kings, King Uzziah's mother, that she was Jecoliah from Jerusalem. It's so important that we, as we go out and find our wives, our spouses, that we're not unequally yoked. And that has more to do with spiritual things than anything else. You don't want Christians marrying non-Christians. Jews should marry Jews. Of course, Jews should be Christians today. They should be Messianic, as we all should be, but it doesn't always work out like that. So from the Jewish perspective, though, and you actually find where God tells them this back in Exodus, as he's preparing them to leave, and he's telling them not to take wives, and then he gets more specific, not to take wives from foreign lands, from foreign peoples. It gets more specific when you look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. So when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and when the Lord God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. So people get kind of upset about that, and there's a lot of arguments over what was God doing by quote unquote killing all the Canaanites. It isn't exactly what happened. But the reason for that, and we actually find out as we read further, but they were worshiping false gods. And I've always scratched my head and wondered, why in the world would the Jews stay in Egypt for 400 years? And there's some scripture somewhere else that will say that when the Canaanites' sin had matured, in other words, they were given enough time to really truly sin against God. It wasn't just a few sins here or there, but it was the whole of society within the land of Canaan that was rebelling against God and worshiping false gods. There could have been stuff with angels. There's all kinds of weirdness going on in the land of Canaan because you had giants and all kinds of strange people. And we know that when the Israelites saw that and got scared, and they spent 40 years wandering in the desert, which was 1 year for every, well, it was 1 year, so 400 years in Egypt. They spent 40 years wandering in the desert because they got 1 year for every 10 years in Egypt. And that was long enough for that generation to die off, and then the next generation that would have faith in God would be able to enter into under Joshua's lead, and enter into the land of Canaan. And so what we see in verse 3 of Deuteronomy chapter 7, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you. So the warning is don't take a wife from the false pagan religion group of people, to put it awkwardly. But don't take these foreign wives, because they're going to lead you away from me. And when you go back and you study through the mothers of the kings, especially of Judah. Now, we're not given a list of the mothers for the kings of Israel as a whole entire, or at least their wives anyways. Sometimes their mothers are listed, and it'll tell you where they're from. But there's more than one place in the Old Testament law that tells them not to take wives from foreign lands, especially foreign peoples. It's not that they can't have any. I mean, you've got Ruth, as I mentioned earlier, with Boaz and the kinsman redeemer stuff. Ruth was a Moabite woman, but she had become a Jew. And she had married a Jew and decided to support her mother-in-law when they came back into Jerusalem. But so her faith had corrected itself from many gods to one God, to the one true God. We see with I just lost my train of thought. But we see that with Rahab was the next one. She saw the power of God. She knew and understood the fear of God, and she became a Jew. And she's in the lineage of Christ. And so where an individual, especially a woman, is coming from outside of Israel and wants to marry into, or gets into a situation to marry into, they convert. And which means they go ahead and they become a Jew. And so it's really interesting to study through the lineage, but you'll see when they marry women, like when Ahab married Jezebel, and she completely just took over. She convinced her husband and her sons to worship false gods, to do all these false things that God would not approve of. And of course, we all know that turned out for her. It's very unfortunate. But we're given plenty of examples of where, when godly people worship and follow the one true God, that they do good things. And when you have a good woman from, Uzziah's mother coming from Jerusalem meant she was already a Jew. And so she's already taught and already been raised in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And she's aware of the law. She's aware of the prophets. She's aware of all the things that she needs to be aware of in order to be a good Jew. And we know that Uzziah did what was right in the sight of the Lord up until he got too arrogant. And that wasn't his mother's fault, because probably by the time he did that, she would probably passed away. And but she raised him properly, along with his father. And so, when you see Abraham sending his servants back to the land of Ur to find a wife for Isaac, you want to know where your people are coming from. You want to know that they're good people, and I'm sure it's distant cousins to a degree, and we have issues and questions and concerns about some of that. But when you go outside of Israel, and we find this, Solomon made this mistake. He had so many wives from outside of Israel, and a lot of that was probably like land deals and stuff, because he increased the kingdom. He did all this stuff and became the wealthiest man in the world. For all of the wisdom he had, he still went and got a little arrogant and did dumb things, and then he was more concerned about his wives, and they wanted to worship their false gods, so he started building them temples, and that caused problems. And we see that with everybody in leadership within Israel. When they would take these wives from these foreign nations, it would lead them, just as it says right here in verse 3 of Deuteronomy chapter 7, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. And so as we reflect on motherhood and the role, the absolute proper role of a mother isn't necessarily to Band-Aid boo-boos, although that's a good part of it, and that's certainly a helpful thing. It's to raise children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So when a mother is doing what she should properly do, she should raise her children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. You know, when Hannah was barren and asked for a child, she asked of God for a child and said, God, if you'll give me a child, I'll give him back to you. I'll let you have him. And so we have one of the greatest prophets in all of Israel's history as a result. Because she was a good mother, she was a good follower of God. She gave him back to God for him to be of service to God. Obviously loving children, loving families, taking care of husbands. And there's so many great things that come from having good mothers who are able to be equally yoked with their husbands in their beliefs, specifically Christian beliefs, where everybody's on the same page. And I wish I knew the statistics right off the top of my head, but if there's a greater chance that the whole family, especially the children, will be saved if the father is already saved. If the mother is saved, your chances go down as you look at it. So from the father down to the child. So if the father's a Christian, there's greater chances that the whole family is going to be a Christian. Whereas if the child becomes a Christian, the numbers basically kind of go backwards, so to speak. It's still good to have that influence in the home, but a child's not going to have near as much influence as a father. And unfortunately, we see all throughout the years, not just now, although I think it's probably greater now, the instances of fatherlessness in the homes. But a good, godly mother is still going to raise her children properly. And they're going to look out for it and know and make sure that the children go to church and that the children are educated, at least in the bare minimum, at least in the crucifixion of Christ and his resurrection. I mean, that gets you going on the right road and that gets you going down the right path. But just taking into consideration the role of the mother, and it's like I said, it's God's design. It's not a societal creation. It's not some tool of the patriarchy or any of this other kind of weirdo stuff that everybody's out there trying to say, who's basically trying to upend and change God's plan. God instituted the family before he ever instituted the church. There's more philosophical discussion to have on that, but essentially that's what happened. He created the family first. And he created the family to work a certain way. A father and a mother to produce the child. And, of course, Christ being the head of the father being the head of the family. And, a wise father and a wise mother will work together to raise their children properly. But, again, that doesn't take away from motherhood. That is a tremendous thing. I'll never know what it's like to carry a child. I know what it's like to put up with one for 17 years. But, it's, and I've had gallstones. So I've had some pain. I've had a broken arm, so I've had some pain, but I'm not trying to say that's anything like what a woman goes through through labor and all that other jazz. But again, that's God's plan and God's design for things. It wasn't for me to have a child. It was for my wife to have the child. It was for the two of us together to make the child, to then raise the child together. And I'm thankful for the women who stay faithful even though they don't have a husband, whether they died or left or whatever happened. I'm so thankful for women that are able to stay faithful when they're raising children by themselves. So we should absolutely give credit to, give thanks and love to our mothers. Again, if it wasn't for mothers, we wouldn't be here. You know, and it's just a tremendous thing to be able to say thank you. And that's a large part of what it is within Christianity, is for us to say thank you to God for what he's done for us. God gave us mothers. Everybody wants to get all excited, well, God's a man, or God's of this, or God's of that, and whatever he is. Of course, he refers to himself as the Father all throughout the Bible, so the fact that an all-knowing God who created all of this, which, I mean, you see with the animals. All the animals had helpmates, right? So Adam's sitting there going, naming all the animals, and he notices they all have helpmates, so there's a male and a female of everything. But he doesn't have a helpmate. And so God, in his wisdom, gave him one. And so we're able to celebrate mothers today because what God did. It's not a matter of whatever societal norm you want to break, you want to change, you want to do whatever. That usually doesn't work well. And so if we go back to God's plan and we do it the way God says do it, and we do our best to get out there and encourage to have fathers in the homes and have a good, godly mother who will encourage and support her husband, father of the children. And it's nice to say if everything is all blood related, but we do know, and you definitely want to acknowledge when you have a stepmother, a step parent that does come along and takes children that are not even hers and raises them properly. But again, it comes down to being raised in and acknowledging God and in the fear of God, which is the beginning of all wisdom, and knowing that whatever you're going to do, you do it through God. So a good, wise, godly mother, whether she can check off all the boxes in Proverbs 31 or not, at least the part where you raise your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, that right there is going to mean so much more than all the rest. You know, and that the other proverb says, train up a child in the way they should go, and they will not depart from it. And the way that's being referenced there is the way of God. It's not about, oh, they're mechanically inclined, or they're musically inclined, or they're talented in this, that, and the other. I mean, those are good things. But the way you should go is the way of the Lord. And if you raise your children in the way of the Lord, and we see that sometimes in society where there's legitimate reasons for the men not to be there. There's wars, there's work, there's, legitimate good reasons for the father to not always be there. It's not always the best thing, but a good godly woman will raise her child. And when you go back and look through the lineage of Christ, and you look at the wives and the mothers of all of the kings of Israel as opposed to the kings of Judah, you find out that the wives of the kings of Judah do the best because they train and teach their children the way they should go in the fear and admonition of the Lord, so that they can be the next king, or that there will be a suitable child that will represent their parents well, and represent the kingdom, and represent God well. So as we go on out today and we go out and spend our time with our families, your children, grandchildren, our parents, our child, let us just remember to not only thank mothers, but thank God for our mothers. And if we do that, we're doing well.